permettez-moi de souhaiter la bienvenue à tous les panélistes et tous les participants à cette discussion. Donc, avec votre permission, je vais demander aux panélistes d'allumer leur caméra afin qu'on puisse s'assurer qu'ils soient tous effectivement présents lors de cette séance. If the panelists could kindly switch on their cameras so that we can ensure everything is fine and we can then proceed, that would be greatly appreciated. So ladies and gentlemen, it's really an honor and a pleasure for me to be moderating this session. I will not be long because we have an excellent and outstanding lineup of panelists with us. I've just been informed that Mr. Marlowe from the Deutsche Bank is unfortunately not in a position to join. Let me check if by any chance he has been able to join. I don't think so. So audience, kindly note that we will not have Mr. Marlowe with us. My name is Desiree Venkatachalam. I'm the Director for Resource Mobilization and Partnerships. And those days I'm quite busy on leading the replenishment of the African Development Fund. And President Adesina has made a very strong appeal for ADF when in his opening remarks. And I would also like to join him in thanking the Japanese authorities who have consistently been putting debt really front and center of the international agenda. So thank you to the Japanese authorities and thank you to all of you. It's a tough act to follow after those very lightening conversations, but very briefly, I'll introduce the panelists today. On a son Excellence, Monsieur le Ministre Andeli de la République du Congo. Monsieur le Ministre, est-ce qu'on peut confirmer que vous m'entendez et que vous pouvez parler? It seems no. Okay. We may not have Minister Andeli. Je vais maintenant aussi vérifier que nous avons Monsieur Cissé, le directeur de la dette publique au ministère des Finances du Sénégal. Monsieur Cissé, est-ce que vous êtes avec nous?
Oui, bonjour Monsieur Désiré, bonjour à tous les autres panélistes et à tous les participants. Je suis donc en ligne avec vous. Merci.
Comme on dit, Negedev. Un plaisir de vous avoir avec nous. Et puis, je suis sûr que nous aurons une conversation extrêmement riche grâce à votre expérience en tant que gestionnaire et directeur de la dette publique au Sénégal.
Merci beaucoup.
We also have the pleasure of having Mr. Toby Illes. We talk about rating agencies from the beginning, so I think we'll benefit greatly from your expertise. Mr. Illes, can you confirm you are audible? You are muted. No, we can't hear you. Mr. Illes, I think we cannot hear you. That's why we run this practice a little bit, just to make sure we hear you. Well, hopefully we'll sort it out, but we seem not to hear you. I'm sure we'll be able to fix it. We also have the pleasure of having Mr. Gregory Smith of the Emerging Market Funds Manager, Merger M&G Investments from London. Mr. Smith, can you confirm you're with us?
Good morning. Yeah, I'm hearing you loud and clear.
Pleasure to have you. And last but not least, we have Mr. Jason Braganza. Asante sana. Are you with us? Jason?
Yes, I'm here. I can hear you very clearly. I hope you can hear me too. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. So let us try to dive in directly into the different topics. I don't think we need to introduce again issues which are to be discussed. I don't see His Excellency Minister from the Republic of Congo. So we'll go directly to Senegal and start with Monsieur Cissé. Donc, Monsieur Cissé, le Sénégal, à plusieurs égards, est considéré comme un excellent élève en matière de gestion de la dette. Je lisais récemment le rapport du Fonds en juin 2022, même si le Sénégal a une situation de dette modérée, mais le Fonds disait qu'il y a quand même pas mal de choses positives qui ont été faites. Et en particulier, étant donné toute la conversation que nous avons eue, j'aimerais peut-être que vous nous parliez un peu de la gestion des finances publiques et de la dette et qu'est-ce que le Sénégal a fait pour améliorer sa gestion de la dette et comment vous voyez les choses dans l'avenir. Donc, il y a pas mal de vulnérabilités. Le Fonds, je pense, dans son rapport, mettait en exergue que le Sénégal peut être sujet à moins d'espace fiscal étant donné les vulnérabilités. Comment est-ce que vous, dans le pratico-pratique, vous gérez ceci et qu'aimeriez-vous que la communauté internationale, et à cet égard, le groupe de la Banque africaine de développement, fasse pour votre pays et pour vous dans votre travail au quotidien? La parole est à vous.
Merci beaucoup, M. Désiré. Je pense que, comme vous l'avez dit, nous avons d'excellentes relations avec la communauté financière, particulièrement donc les bailleurs de fonds traditionnels, qu'ils soient multilatéraux ou bilatéraux. C'est une longue donc coopération, collaboration que nous avons donc avec eux, qui est donc basée sur un dialogue permanent, sur donc des échanges réguliers relativement donc disons, aux défis auxquels nous faisons face. Et nous discutons donc aussi bien du diagnostic que des solutions qui sont peut-être les plus appropriées. Il faut peut-être déjà saluer le fait que le processus est un processus, disons, partagé, qui responsabilise les autorités locales sur les choix de politique publique qu'elles arrêtent et qu'elles mettent en œuvre, en se basant également sur l'expertise donc du FMI, de la Banque mondiale et de l'ensemble donc des partenaires avec qui nous échangeons régulièrement. Je pense que l'un des points importants, c'est d'avoir ce dialogue-là franc, sur la base d'une situation donc éclairée par des revues régulières qui sont donc objectives sur le diagnostic, parce que c'est comme ça qu'on adressera ensemble peut-être les solutions les plus pertinentes. Bien entendu, il y a quand même un certain nombre d'engagements que cela requiert en termes d'amélioration du cadre macro-budgétaire. Bon, ça, je pense que c'est des fondamentaux qu'il faut quand même donc remplir pour s'engager sur une relation comme celle que nous avons pu instaurer depuis quelques années avec donc la communauté financière internationale, qui est basée sur l'édification par nos propres soins, non pas de nos priorités, afin de nos orientations, et également, je pense que ça va peut-être susciter beaucoup plus d'appropriation et d'engagement à ce niveau. Maintenant, pour parler plus spécifiquement de la dette publique, de la gestion de la dette publique, bon, je pense que l'inflexion d'un point de vue qualitatif que nous avons amorcé, c'est déjà avec la mise en place de la direction de la dette publique. Parce qu'auparavant, au Sénégal, la gestion de la dette publique était multipolaire. Il y a eu plusieurs intervenants qui, chacun donc dans un périmètre de compétences restreint, mettaient en œuvre donc une partie donc de la gestion de la dette publique. La première chose que nous avons faite, c'est au terme donc de plusieurs donc analyses et diagnostics, de mettre en place d'un point de vue institutionnel la direction de la dette publique pour fédérer l'ensemble des services qui interviennent dans le processus d'endettement et même de gestion de la dette publique. Donc, j'ai eu l'honneur, moi, depuis le début, d'être responsabilisé à la tête donc, de cette unité qui est donc ancré au niveau du ministère des Finances et plus précisément au sein de la Direction générale de la comptabilité publique et du Trésor. Bon, c'est un ancrage que nous avons voulu asseoir pour davantage mettre en exergue le lien entre la gestion de la trésorerie et celle donc de la dette publique à laquelle elle est intimement donc liée. Ceci étant, comme le périmètre de gestion de la dette est beaucoup plus large que la seule direction de la dette publique, nous avons redynamisé également un cadre qui est plutôt un cadre fêtier qui regroupe, au-delà de la direction de la dette publique, l'ensemble des services, des directions, entités qui, par moment, peu ou prou, interviennent donc dans la gestion de la dette. Ce cadre, ça s'appelle le Comité national de dette publique. Et il a à connaître de l'ensemble donc des décisions d'endettement avant même qu'elles ne soient prises ou implémentées. Donc, qu'elles fassent l'objet d'une analyse préalable, d'une validation technique, également avec un avis assorti porté à l'attention des autorités sur les orientations à mettre en relief dans le cadre peut-être donc de la finalisation des processus concernant ces actes-là. Ce sont des avis consultatifs, certes, mais qui quand même, du point de vue de l'autorité, sont considérés comme suffisamment substantiels pour fonder et éclairer donc la décision de l'autorité. Ça, je pense que ça a permis véritablement d'encadrer la gestion de la dette publique. Maintenant, au-delà, nous avons nous-mêmes mis en place un certain nombre de manuels de procédure pour indiquer pour chaque processus d'endettement ou de gestion de la dette, quels sont les prérequis, quelles sont les exigences, l'organisation, les modalités à suivre. Ça, je pense que ça permet quand même de donner de la clarté, de la visibilité, de définir clairement les rôles et responsabilités des uns et des autres, et de manière à aller sur un processus quand même maîtrisé. Le dernier point que je voulais soulever, je sais que le temps est très réduit et doit être géré, c'est quand même donc, je l'avais dit, cet échange régulier avec les partenaires qui nous amène à partager de l'information, mais également à faire conjointement des exercices donc, de formulation de stratégies de dette à moyen terme, mais également des analyses de viabilité de la dette. J'entendais quelqu'un dans le premier panel parler également de bulletins statistiques. Ça, c'est également des pratiques que nous avons réinstaurées, revivifiées, pour permettre véritablement que le suivi de la dette se fasse quand même de façon assez rapprochée, que les alertes, s'il y a lieu également, soient très tôt données sur un peu le niveau d'engagement, sur la structure de la dette, sur les défis auxquels nous sommes confrontés. Et je pense que c'est comme ça que nous avons pu progressivement donc, améliorer donc, cette gestion de la dette au Sénégal. Et tout dernier point, le renforcement des capacités, c'est extrêmement important. Et c'est le lieu pour moi de remercier le FMI, la Banque mondiale particulièrement, la BAD également, qui nous ont accompagnés véritablement dans la capacitation donc, de nos ressources et dans la mise en place des ressources matérielles, techniques, qui nous permettent véritablement d'avoir accès à des applications, à des équipements, à des logiciels qui nous permettent véritablement de suivre notre dette, de mieux donc la gérer de façon automatisée et de voir également comment est-ce qu'elle évolue dans le temps et dans l'espace. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Cissé. Je pense que votre point sur le renforcement des capacités fait écho excellemment à ce que le professeur Kevin Kourama disait dans la session précédente et on aura l'occasion d'y revenir par la suite. I see that Edward has been able to join us. Welcome, Edward. It's a pleasure to have you. I was lamenting the fact that you may not be able to join, so I'm delighted to have you with us. So thanks and welcome. I don't know if is Toby online? He was online and then he may have dropped. So hopefully he will be in a position to join.
Can you hear me now or not?
Oh yes, Toby, I hear you. So let's follow up with you. Let's keep the ball rolling and bring you in. So you heard what Senegal just said. Very proactive measures being taken, sort of a positive report card with risks issued by quite a number of institutions. You also heard the representative from Ethiopia in the previous session. I'm sure you were listening carefully when he was talking about, the risk of downgrade. The perception that there may be this downgrade. So, when you look at the literature and you look at the discussion, there's this two sides of a coin. On the one side, the G20, as a panelist said before, has been innovating with DSSI. There's now a common framework. But on the other hand, countries are saying, if they actually grab this opportunity, you guys are going to downgrade them. What's happening? Help us.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Thanks for inviting me on. Yeah, I guess we're often the bad guys in these situations, but yeah, I think maybe one thing that's useful is to just lay out what sort of debt restructurings mean for credit ratings, and just highlight the distinction there between when debt's owed to private creditors and when debt's owed to official creditors. So, I mean, for Fitch, ratings are an assessment of the capacity and willingness to honor debt obligations to private creditors in full and on time. And so when for example, a country announces a Eurobond restructuring, then the rating will move down and eventually would be in default. And then on completion of the restructuring, we would then issue a sort of fresh rating, which is based on a kind of forward-looking assessment of the fundamentals for that country. And then so clearly that process can take time, or it can be quick. On the other side of a debt restructuring, sustainability can look better than before. On the other hand, when there's a restructuring of official creditor debt, then that's not deemed a default for the rating agencies. And this is where we have a distinction between the DSSI and the common framework. So the DSSI, no sovereigns had ratings that were impacted at all. This was only official creditor debt, no impact on ratings. Of course, with the common framework, as you say, that it's different. So we have this comparability of treatment principle enshrined there. And so that brings with it the risk that private creditors will kind of also experience some kind of change in the terms of their holdings. And so, as a rating agency, the ratings have to reflect that. And so that sort of explains what's happening there. Of course, it's kind of an interesting one. I mean, take Ethiopia, for example, announcing their intention to use the common framework, and so then we did downgrade Ethiopia, and yet, of course, private debt to private creditors is a small share of Ethiopia's overall debt. So, it could seem like that's a kind of heavy-handed response, but it just really flows from what a rating means. So it's that kind of explains it. Of course, then, I get the other side of the coin, that then you might find yourself, well, if your rating's gone down or you're in default, then borrowing becomes more difficult. So then if this whole situation is protracted, then that's definitely a hurdle. So that's on that particular issue. I mean, more broadly, I guess, on debt sustainability, factors that can support credits in Africa, on the continent. I mean, I think, as we saw earlier in the conference with Professor Urama's presentation, there's been a trend of rising debt to GDP, etc., interest to revenue. When you look at government debt to revenue, you have this kind of quite high metrics in sub-Saharan Africa. So 350% debt to revenue is the median for Fitch-rated sub-Saharan African sovereigns, and that's higher than any other region in the world. For some, that's much higher. So I think one sort of key issue here is increasing debt tolerance through better revenue mobilization. So I think that's kind of clearly one area that stands out. I mean, there's whole host of factors, but that's one that stands out. And I guess the other one, which a lot of people have mentioned so far, relates to sort of debt management issues. So transparency, communication, reducing that any sort of uncertainty or gaps in information for creditors helps can help trim interest costs. you know, can help countries make the best use of all available sources of finance, etc. So those are a couple of factors more on sort of broader debt sustainability issues.
Thanks. I think this is very clear. It shows that debt sustainability is clearly a multifaceted issue, not a straightforward one. You keep us on our toes, and you know, that's the function. So we thank you for this clear answer. But it seems also that countries can be caught between a rock and a hard place. Now, you know, Edward, I was reading a Bloomberg article recently, which is quite bullish on Africa's debt, sort of, you know, maybe I'm pushing it a little. You know, you listen to Senegal, you listen to the previous panelists, you listen to the rating agencies, but you're coming from Deutsche Bank. That's big. And it seems to be quite bullish, at least on some economies on the continent, even on debt. So what's your take? Am I mistaken? How do you see all that panning out?
I think you have to be, as I think you intimated, selective. I mean, there are certain economies, obviously, debt sustainability is possible, and it's got much harder for other economies. And I think we can. I would take a view that there's a likelihood of some restructuring from certain economies in sub-Saharan Africa. But people remain bullish. I mean, people are looking for opportunity, and people, certainly in the commercial lending world, I mean, they're not going in to lend to African countries out of, I suppose, a feeling of you know, generosity. I mean, they're there really to make money. So while you know, ratings are down, you know, the cost of funding has become more expensive, and the alternatives are quite attractive to commercial lenders. The opportunity in sub-Saharan Africa remains very much the same. So I would, from my side, certainly remain bullish selectively. And certainly going forward, I think, and what has been really interesting actually over the last hour or so is listening to the three countries that have presented about how they've gone through the issues that they've gone through. And so I was very, very pleased to hear from both Ethiopia and also from Zambia how they're promoting the transparency of what of their existing debts, as indeed obviously is Chad. They all face difficulties, and they despite the fear of some other sub-Saharan African countries, they've been willing to actually go through this process. And that to me has been extremely helpful because its transparency is critical. As a private lender, certainly in the banks I've been at, what has been key to us is actually sharing information with people like the IMF, actually fully understanding total debt capacity of the countries that we lend to, and making sure that the lending is actually appropriate. So transparency is critical. There are various forms, obviously, of lending. Traditionally, the Eurobond market, use of proceeds has not been a key consideration, but I have seen some countries in sub-Saharan Africa demonstrating very much what the use of proceeds are going to be. Other forms of commercial lending, absolutely critical to use of proceeds. And I think that's probably something I'd see going forward. So sensible use of funds, perhaps some sort of reprofiling, attendance obviously to the ratings agency. And actually it's great hearing Toby just before me because, you know, critical to our investors, let's call them that, the people who are actually coming alongside syndicated loans, etc., is faith in the ratings of those countries that we're providing access to the commercial markets for. But the final point, I think it's been raised a couple of times, you know, 39% of lending into sub-Saharan Africa is now private. That is a great advance, actually. So I think if the private creditor community are willing and able to actually finance sub-Saharan African countries, that's moving very much the right direction, despite the difficult times we're going through.
Thank you so much, Edward. We'll come back to one word which is sort of coming up again and again. It's the issue of big issue of transparency. I'll come back to you, all of you, and ask for maybe examples of what to do or what not to do, if you have anything in mind. So maybe we can follow up on that. So thanks a lot. But, you know, we have also the privilege of having with us someone who's written a book, Gregory. You wrote a book entitled Where Credit is Due, How Africa's Debt Can Be a Benefit, Not a Burden. I think I'm correct. That's you penned down this book, and you've listened to the previous three colleagues speaking, and especially what Edward said, quite bullish also, selectively bullish, what Senegal has done, the view from the rating agency, from where you sit. And I think you asked the same question in an op-ed you wrote, to an article I saw on the web, where the big challenge is when the Eurobond markets will open again for African countries. So bearing in mind what all the international community is doing, the efforts to resolve the debt, what is your answer? Where do we take it from here?
Thanks very much. Yeah, and it's a book I'm very proud of that tells the story of African debt. And one of the key conclusions is that African solutions must take center stage. So I'm delighted to be here at an African Development Bank event, and I hope some of the ideas will be useful for your leadership role. I think what's very important at the moment is we're in a time of really tough global markets, not just for Africa, not just for emerging markets, but all over the world. And we've got these Kilimanjaro high spreads, these high yields that are making it very, very expensive to borrow. And all of this is in a climate of inflation and the threat of advanced economy recession. So the market access has been effectively shut for all but a few African countries this year. And all this is happening while these debt vulnerabilities mount, which were alluded to in the earlier session. So we should all be alarmed. But markets will likely improve, but perhaps not from Kilimanjaro all the way down to the coast, but maybe we settle on a plateau of slightly higher interest rates, of maybe a US 10-year being at 3 or 4% rather than 2.4%, while we've seen this increase in borrowing. So it's going to be a bit harder to access the market, I think, and market access can be earned, but it'll be harder. But this is, and then on the positive side, hopefully there are flows of financing for the climate transition and for sustainability ends. But when I hear the talks by the different governments and in the people I've spoken to in many different African countries, the good news is that there's a lot that can be done in order to achieve better borrowing. And I've got a lot of these ideas in my book. And a key spoiler is that there's no silver bullet. There's no one thing that fixes everything. There are many steps, and each of which take a lot of effort. And I'll touch on a few just now. For me, the key one is to develop domestic markets. It's to borrow in your own currency. The countries that were able to do this gigantic fiscal stimulus during the pandemic were countries that were able to borrow in their own currency. That was much harder for countries borrowing in other countries' currencies. And the AFDB is playing an important role, which I think it should extend in this area. And it's looking to where capital leaks can be plugged and more African wealth can also be invested in domestically and around the region, I think is crucial. Secondly, I'd like to see more flexible financing. Debt instruments that are automatically extended during a time of crisis. One of the problems is it's quite hard to do a quick reprofiling during a crisis because you get the credit rating downgrades, you get the loss of sentiment, you get the reduction in confidence. But if we could have some flexible financing, and there's quite a few ideas on how to do this, we could see that breathing space was automatically given to countries during a crisis. You've mentioned debt transparency, which is crucial. I think information flows are mostly important to me because transparency leads to accountability. I'm more optimistic about countries where there's a national debate on debt, on the radio, in the newspapers, around the streets. Debt information needs to flow everywhere and people need to debate it. I think countries need to build solid plans and build a sustainable brand ready to attract financing for the climate transition. And in that, countries can borrow with purpose, with a much tighter use of proceeds. So instead of borrowing for the 2022 budget, it needs to be for clear investments, X, Y, and Z, that have been properly vetted and a part of a much wider public investment management system. On the trade-offs and tougher choices, I'll just say that I think countries with that need to say no more. They need to be much more picky from whom they borrow and say no to many of the smart suits coming in the door. Countries need to coordinate, and it's difficult with political cycles, pressure to invest, but there needs to be a consideration of not just financing gaps, but also implementation gaps. So the investment is not only going to the right projects, but it's going to the right projects at the right time. And as I said, what we haven't done over the last 10, 15 years is bolster the public investment management systems enough. And I think this is crucial for countries going through a restructuring and are going to borrow on the other side, and for countries that are doing all the things needed to avoid a debt crisis. Public investment management is crucial. I'll finish on a note of good news, because there's a lot of debate about the G20 common framework, but I do think progress is being made. And while results have been quite slow, these initiatives will be defined by their results. And compared to results from other restructurings like Sri Lanka that don't follow that route, I think one major flaw at the moment is information sharing. We've talked about parallel tracks, but at the moment, there's this need to get all creditors on the same page, discussing and coming up with ideas. At the moment, it feels that certain creditors have all the information and they're not sharing it early enough. And I think that's why we've gone from months to years with these schemes. So whatever we design next needs to have information sharing up front of debt sustainability analysis, debt analysis, and conversation. And I think what we need to do over the next 1 or 2 years, as we approach a wall of maturing African Eurobonds, is come up with a system where there are a menu of options, so countries can choose what's best for them rather than something that's provided off the shelf. And the lessons from the 80s and 90s debt crisis for me were, firstly, that we need net new financing flowing in. And I think the AFDB is well placed to recycle SDRs to provide market access parachutes to strengthen countries' credentials to attract financing. And as I said at the start, African solutions need to take center stage. We need much more information flow from the countries into these schemes. So rather than it being a sort of G20 meeting, it needs to be something where African finance ministers are in the room and coming up with the ideas and can sort of help design the menu of options that then they can select if they get into debt trouble. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Gregory. You use a few quote unquote big words. You said we should all be alarmed. So let's see if really we have to be alarmed, but you ended on a positive note. And when you spoke about SDRs, I was very pleased because we indeed at the African Development Bank have a very strong proposal on that, and we will be happy to engage further. And we're quite confident that we can make it work. But Jason, let me turn it to you. And I was saying we were quite, you heard what the panelists have said. In particular, Gregory just concluded on sort of a positive note. And he also said, you need to be able to say no. You are in the business of policy advisory at Afrodat. How do you say no? But more broadly, when do you say no? And when do you say yes? And when do you empower? When are you empowered to give such an answer? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Desiree, and to the colleagues at the African Development Bank and the government of Japan for hosting this and for inviting African civil society to be part of this very important conversation. When do you say no? I think the illustration and the example given by Mr. Kabwe in the previous session is a very explicit example of when to say no, and this is when there is, and similarly by Mr. Mr. Ahmed from Ethiopia, when the debt is not recouping and returning revenue or generating sufficient revenue. I think the explicit examples there are pretty much a very clear indicator that debt then is not working, and that it is potentially creating a lot more harm than good, and then creates a potential vicious cycle, which that is then perpetuated by drop in credit ratings, inability to access financing, and therefore you're caught up in this ever vicious cycle of having to borrow to stay, or borrow from then multilateral institutions to then stay afloat. So I think the examples that we are facing with countries like Chad, Ethiopia, Zambia, and now more recently countries like Zimbabwe, Malawi, Mozambique, Ghana, Nigeria, are very explicit examples where that very simple phrase "no" ought to have been applied quite a long time ago. I think the second point of how do you know when it is the right time to say no, or how do you go about saying no? I think, again, not to sort of pick on Zambia, but the examples that Mr. Kabwe gave were very explicit. It's the sectoral investment of debt. Where is it actually going? You know, you are, and how is it defined and negotiated? If you are investing in highly mega infrastructure projects that, number one, take extremely long to complete, have extremely long repayment periods, but also tend to come with user fees or user costs. Like in some countries across the continent, in Kenya, where I come from, we've just completed this less than 20, or slightly more than 20 kilometer expressway that is built, you know, pretty much using public debt, but then it's a user fee, it's a toll road. So I think that there's some illustrations here in terms of the type of sectors where debt is being invested in that perhaps is creating an additional unnecessary burden on public resources, particularly at a time of crisis. And I think even Mr. Babakar Sise has mentioned it. It then constricts your fiscal policy space and puts one in a very difficult position. So I think that is the analysis perhaps we may want to consider on how and when is it appropriate for us to say no when we're looking at the sectoral investment of debt instruments in that sense. The final point of, the final response in terms of when to say no, or how to say no, or how do you build the capacity to say no, is diversity. I think the impact of public debt in Africa is very heterogeneous at the national economic policy making level, but it's also further heterogeneous at the citizen level. Understanding where the impact of debt crises that are affecting our countries at the citizen level is extremely important. You take, for example, the certain IMF programs that are now being requested by many of our African governments. You see that very soon public services, social protection programs, public sector wage bill are very soon going to come under severe pressure under very strict fiscal consolidation programs. And this has a very direct impact on the ability to understand, to know and nuance where debt is having a direct impact on people. And I think this is the third part of how do we build that capacity to say no, is to really humanize this current crisis, the current financial architecture, that, you know, at the end of the day, public debt, if cannot be paid back according to the terms and conditions, has a very live and real human face. And those faces tend to be women, children, young people. If Africa is going to reap from the young population dividend, then we need to find a way of understanding that the public debt or the use of debt as an instrument for transformation, or the use of as an instrument for achieving Agenda 2063 needs to be managed in a very sustainable way. All the panelists from the first panel to the one we're discussing right now have talked about the importance of information gaps and how does this undermine the relationship between borrower and lender. I would further go and say the information gaps that exist between the state borrower and the rights holders that are citizens is extremely glaring and extremely a big challenge. You do have pockets of examples. Zambia is one, Kenya is another, where they are making strides, but that information gap in itself does present a very telling challenge when we're talking about how do we prepare ourselves and how do we increase the capacity and the capability to say no to debt, and that it reaches a point that it is becoming unsustainable. And I think the final point I'd like to make as part of the conversations here is that we need to recognize that the ecosystem requires and demands that there needs to be some sort of African agency. And this means that, prioritizing the needs and the demands of Africa as a continent. I think Gregory has alluded to this, and he says, he's got some ideas there in his book as well. But I do think it is important, the common position that the AU finance ministers made in Dakar a few weeks ago with regard to special drawing rights, with regard to an extension of the rethinking of the DSSI, and so on, are very good illustrations of their coming together of prioritizing the continent as opposed to the creditors. So I think I'll just sort of leave it there in terms of responding, Desiree, to the three-part question of how one thinks of the word no in that sense. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Jason. Je pense que c'est une réponse très riche qui, en fait, met en avant, juste dans votre point de conclusion, un peu cet écart qu'il y a au niveau de l'information et entre les différents tenants et aboutissants de ce dialogue sur la dette. Et c'est peut-être l'opportunité pour moi de faire en conclusion un bref tour de table virtuel avec la question que j'ai annoncée en préambule, c'est pour vous, chacun d'entre vous, si je peux me permettre de vous poser cette question, quelle serait la décision ou l'action la plus importante en matière de transparence de la dette qui devrait être prise? S'il y avait une action que dans votre propre affaire, dans ce que vous gérez, que voudriez-vous voir en matière de transparence? C'est vraiment, vous avez entendu le président du groupe de la banque, vous avez entendu les autorités japonaises, vous avez entendu le fonds, William, tout le monde qui parlait, et toutes les actions qui sont prises au niveau global en matière de transparence. But from where you sit, what would be that number one action on debt transparency? Let me start with Edward, because you are really in the business of leveraging the funds for the country. From your standpoint, what would you like to see?
Well, I think actually Gregory made a very good point. I mean, and he said it as right projects. So any sort of sovereign borrower or sub-Saharan Africa, in this particular case, or African borrower, if they have a very detailed plan and they have a focus on the right type of infrastructure projects, there shouldn't be too much difficulty in borrowing to finance those. Now we've seen people borrowing from all parts of the world, including the Chinese, etc., to facilitate and enable major projects. But people will want to finance those. Now, at the moment, obviously there is a difficulty in that pricing is particularly high. Both the Eurobond market is certainly at the moment, sort of, I would suggest unaffordable. Although that's not going to continue forever. I mean, there's going to be, that will open up again. And similarly, commercial lending is going to be expensive. But proper infrastructure projects, which the details are there, will also attract ECA capabilities of different nations that are hoping to help, or obviously enable their own industries or businesses to participate, and that will sort of help increase tenor. That will reduce pricing, and I think that will enable a lot of these projects to be developed. But I think transparency has become critical. The type of general commercial loans or syndicated loans that the banks do, the transparency is absolutely critical. So use of proceeds is fundamental to those loans. And I think going forward, perhaps while the Eurobond market will be not specific use of proceeds, where it can be, I think that will also be very important. Similarly, commercial lenders, I think it's important for them. And I think in my experience now, that's very much the case. They enable transparency themselves. So there should be discussion on their part, both the government and indeed with the IMF and others. So total debt for a country, so people can actually really ascertain if it's sustainable, needs to be something that's out there in the public forum. So particularly important.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll go on the virtual table and ask you to stay maybe within a minute to give a chance to colleagues to ask questions. Let me move from Edward to Toby from the rating agency perspective.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, I mean, some of the points I think have been raised already. So by Edward and Gregory there, that more information on the debt, on the creditors, the composition of debt, and especially if we're getting different types of debt, that can often, what the terms of those are can sometimes be a bit unclear. Actually, even with say syndicated loans, but especially if we start seeing more innovative forms of financing. So yeah, I think just being able to understand what's out there, and then when you combine that with what we've been discussing on pipelines of projects and how the money will be used, then those are two quite powerful things in combination. I guess one other point slightly differently on transparency, just linking back to the common framework, I think that's been quite challenging is, which has also come up, is and has been suggested as one of the kind of enhancements that could be made, is just that there's been lags of time where there's just very little information, and so one doesn't really know what's going on. Obviously those in the creditor committees would know, but others don't. So I think that's kind of can add to the kind of sense of it sort of losing momentum. So I think if that'd be one area within that initiative to work on.
Thank you. Let's go to Gregory and then ask the same question. And in addition to what has been said, but also if you have any insight from what lenders can also do, not only borrowers, but also lenders. That's a question which came up on the chat.
Absolutely. So lenders need to be publishing the terms and conditions of what they lend, and they need to say up front to countries, this is what we're going to do. You see that for the multilaterals. You see that for many of the bilaterals, but not all. Eurobond borrowing, all the information's very clear. They're all listed on stock markets. So the key gaps are a few bilaterals and syndicated loans from banks that just need to be made public by those institutions on their website. So lenders need to clearly provide information so people can search and use that. Because we've got all these wonderful think tanks, and whenever I think about debt, and however much I try to simplify it, it's still complicated. It's complicated in terms, in conditions, and what we need is a public debate in all countries. And I think one of the hardest jobs is to be in a debt management office. You're under huge pressure from the politicians in your country. You're under huge pressure from many different people, and it's difficult to sort of push back on some of the more politically driven ideas. But I think where there's a culture of putting the data in the public, encouraging understanding and think tanks, I think this plays to your advantage, because then there's a proper discussion about projects, and hopefully some of the worst ideas can be rejected and some of the better projects can come through. So there's work to do for several lenders, and then we just need to keep explaining things. And I don't think of transparency as sort of massive hidden debt conspiracy, but just a general fog and confusion that we can solve with better information.
Thank you, Gregory. To quote you, one of our hardest jobs is to be in the public debt management office. That's why, Babakar, we come to you last. We want to hear from you. We know it's a tough job. So before going to Babakar, Jason, you gave quite a lot in your first round of answers. What's your take? Jason? Hello?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Desiree. I think for me, it's publish everything, put it out there in the domain, and let people sort of make up their mind about everything and how it's going. I think information, we live in a day and age where information is truly power, and those who interact with our governments, with our politicians. And so there is this level of expectation that, strengthening and reinforcing the social contract between citizen and the state, that there should be a very smooth flow of information. I think the cases that have been brought through litigation, for example, the Mozambique tuna bond scandal, are one of many sets of evidence or examples why it is important to publish and to make all information accessible to the general public. A decade or so ago, there's also been, there had been the issue of the legality of certain borrowing or the illegality of certain borrowing, and how that is then sort of passed on from generation to generation and government to government, because people just don't know what officials are doing. So I do think it is important that we're not afraid to publish and put the information there in the public domain for people to understand what is currently going on. So yeah, I think that would be my sort of 2 minutes on transparency. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Babakar, vous avez entendu les 4 intervenants précédents. Un des intervenants a même dit que vous avez le boulot le plus difficile, si je ne m'abuse. Donc vous êtes, on est chanceux de vous avoir parce que vous avez vraiment la main dans le moteur. Vous voyez comment ça se passe. Parlez-nous un peu de ça. Vous avez entendu les différentes parties prenantes, mais vous, quel est votre point de vue pour conclure?
Mais merci beaucoup, Désiré. Vous avez dit l'an dernier et j'ai pu peut-être noter les différentes préoccupations, en tout cas des collègues participants, panélistes donc, dans cette session. Alors, moi, sur ce volet de la transparence, je voulais peut-être mettre l'accent sur 2 considérations majeures. Je pense qu'ils sont même ressortis dans les interventions précédentes. Le premier aspect important, c'est, comme on l'a dit souvent ici, c'est l'information. Ça, je pense que c'est capital. Déjà d'avoir la bonne information, donc d'être capable de pouvoir la collecter, de pouvoir donc la compiler en termes de consolidation statistique et de pouvoir l'analyser de façon donc appropriée. Et ça fait appel à nos capacités à avoir des systèmes statistiques assez donc développés, modernes, qui puissent permettre d'avoir donc cette information-là de façon régulière, de façon sécure, donc dans un environnement technologique qui peut être contraint au maximum les possibilités de manipulation, de manière à ce que l'information qui est livrée soit une information fiable et exhaustive dans la mesure du possible. C'est important parce que ça nous donne une perspective globale, véritablement donc de la problématique, et permet de faire un diagnostic vraiment approprié. Donc ça, c'est important, je l'ai évoqué, les outils, faire en sorte que les États souverains, les emprunteurs puissent avoir des outils qui puissent leur permettre donc d'avoir cette information-là de façon large. Je prends un peu le cas du Sénégal, nous avons cet outil qui dans un premier temps, à l'instar de beaucoup d'États, était juste limité au périmètre de la dette de l'État administration centrale. Mais maintenant, de plus en plus, nous sommes sur un processus d'élargissement. C'est-à-dire, au-delà de la dette de l'État, nous comprenons maintenant la dette des entités parapubliques parce qu'elle représente quand même un risque budgétaire qui peut ne pas être négligeable. Donc, nous avons pour ambition de l'étendre davantage aux collectivités territoriales et aux organismes de sécurité sociale, de manière à avoir véritablement l'ensemble des collectivités publiques dans le périmètre de suivi donc, de l'information sur la dette. C'est extrêmement important et une fois que c'est recueilli, que l'on fasse régulièrement des analyses de viabilité de la dette à l'échelle donc, de ce périmètre, qui permet d'avoir un diagnostic de l'existant. Et ce diagnostic-là va mettre le focus sur les coûts de l'endettement, sur les risques également auxquels cet endettement-là expose. Et bien entendu, ce qui va en résulter, c'est de donner des orientations, des recommandations, tant en termes de politique publique que de choix d'instruments et de sources de financement qui sont appropriés. Tantôt, j'entendais des préoccupations sur à quoi sert la dette. Est-ce que également la dette permet de se procurer également des ressources? J'ai un peu suivi le point de liaison là-dessus. Mais il faut savoir qu'il faut quand même répondre à divers besoins par diverses sources de financement. Donc, quand nous mettons par exemple le focus sur des ressources concessionnelles, c'est pour les employés à financer des projets qui sont plutôt sociaux, qui ont peut-être une faible rentabilité financière, mais peut-être un peu plus d'impact au plan social et au plan économique. Parce qu'il faut savoir que quand on est administration, on n'a pas véritablement en bandoulière pour première préoccupation la rentabilité purement financière. Nous, c'est une rentabilité économique et sociale que nous considérons. Bon, bien entendu, quand on investit dans les secteurs comme les secteurs sociaux, il n'y aura pas beaucoup de ressources générées immédiatement. Mais de façon différée, oui, ça va améliorer le capital humain, ça va améliorer les conditions d'existence de vie, ça va développer une plus grande activité économique dont nous attendons de façon différée, donc à effet retardé, les impacts économiques en termes d'activités développées, de recettes qu'on va davantage engranger et avoir donc une capacité nous-mêmes à faire face à nos obligations sans recourir à de la dette pour remplacer de la dette. Ça, ce sont des considérations extrêmement importantes qu'il faut prendre et tout cela découle véritablement donc de l'analyse qui permet d'apparier les besoins aux sources de financement. C'est important. La deuxième chose que je voulais dire, et ça adresse maintenant les procédures, les modalités. Il faut quand même que l'endettement se passe dans un cadre qui est bien défini, qui dit dans quelles conditions on recourt à la dette et avec quelle autorisation. C'est donc des besoins qui dérivent déjà d'un déficit budgétaire qui est lui-même donc déterminé dans le cadre d'un cadrage macroéconomique et un cadrage macro-budgétaire qui est fait avec nos partenaires. Donc, tous les États membres font des revues qui leur permettent d'adresser de façon pluriannuelle leurs besoins et de les calibrer avec donc les possibilités qu'ils ont en termes de marge, de viabilité et de soutenabilité, de manière à avoir donc un niveau de déficit compatible donc avec des exigences de viabilité. Et le financement qui est autorisé en termes d'endettement par les institutions législatives, les assemblées parlementaires, etc., doit donc prendre en compte un peu ces informations données par le cadrage. Donc, tant qu'on est a priori dans des besoins adressés par le cadrage, nous sommes dans la viabilité, voire même de la soutenabilité quand on adresse les bonnes sources au vu de leurs caractéristiques et un peu de leur impact en termes de services, en termes de structure. Est-ce que c'est de la dette extérieure, concessionnelle, commerciale, etc. Donc, ces analyses-là sont extrêmement importantes et il faut les faire régulièrement, soi-même, et les partager également avec les institutions, ou tout au moins partager les informations à la base avec les institutions pour qu'elles le fassent et qu'elles viennent partager avec vous leurs conclusions, de manière à ce que, de façon consensuelle, on dise voilà les possibilités que nous avons, voilà les vulnérabilités auxquelles nous nous exposons, et voilà peut-être les mesures qu'il faut prendre pour les atténuer. Et c'est dans ce cadre-là, par exemple, que nous avons des échanges réguliers avec le fonds sur l'AVD, sur la SDMT, mais également avec une préoccupation majeure sur un aspect qui est maintenant de plus en plus important, c'est sur les garanties. Nous en avons parlé dans le premier panel. Ça, c'est des modalités qui permettent peut-être de ne pas avoir un endettement direct massif, mais quand même de façon indirecte, de donner peut-être sa garantie à des financements qui, le cas échéant, et on ne sait pas, devraient peut-être faire appel un peu à votre implication pour vous subroger aux droits et obligations de l'entité initialement bénéficiaire. C'est des points importants. Et ça adresse également un peu la documentation, les aspects contractuels de nos financements. Sur quelle base? Quels sont les objectifs qui sont visés? Je pense qu'il faut que des discussions soient faites à ce niveau-là pour que les clauses ou les conditionnalités de nos endettements soient définies de façon appropriée en considération des capacités véritablement donc, de nos États à pouvoir donc, tenir ces engagements-là auxquels ils souscrivent. Le dernier aspect que je veux mettre en exergue, c'est le fait que volontairement, qu'on se livre à des exercices, à des examens, à des audits, donc qui sont menés de façon externe, de façon interne, mais qu'il y ait régulièrement des audits sur comment la dette est contractée, comment elle est gérée, donc des audits qui vont adresser des aspects fonctionnels même de l'organisation des services, pour voir est-ce qu'il y a des gaps, à quel niveau, de quelle nature et comment les résorber. Parlant de ces audits-là, nous les faisons régulièrement avec le Fonds, avec la Banque mondiale, les exercices d'impact, etc. Ça, ce sont des exercices qui couvrent l'ensemble donc des aspects de la dette, fonctionnelle, institutionnelle, etc., pour dire à tous les niveaux quels sont les progrès qui ont été faits, quels sont les gaps qui existent et quelles sont véritablement les actions concrètes à faire pour les améliorer. Et ça, je pense que c'est quand même des exercices volontaristes qui peuvent permettre en définitive d'améliorer. Le tout dernier point, c'est la notation. C'est également un exercice de revue, si l'on veut, pour évaluer la capacité, mais également la volonté à faire face à ces obligations financières. Et c'est une analyse indépendante faite par des agences qui ont une information, enfin, qui recueillent une information suffisante pour fonder un peu leur appréciation, un peu donc sur la crédibilité donc, de l'émetteur noté, à pouvoir contracter, à pouvoir respecter un peu ces engagements-là. Je pense que ça, ce sont des aspects, de mon point de vue, sur lesquels il faudrait qu'on consolide un peu les progrès qui ont été faits, parce qu'il y a beaucoup de choses qui ont été faites là-dessus. L'information qui doit rentrer dans le domaine public, je dois dire que l'ensemble des États qui souscrivent des politiques de revue, des programmes économiques et financiers, donnent de l'information qui sont, comment dire, mises en ligne par les institutions concernées. Maintenant, il faut aller vers peut-être une information plus citoyenne. Moi, je dis, par exemple, dans le cadre de l'État du Sénégal, la stratégie, elle accompagne le document qui va à l'Assemblée nationale, porté à l'information des députés, qui donc ont tout le loisir d'adresser un peu les préoccupations qu'ils ont en tant que représentants donc, des populations, pour dire est-ce que nous, les orientations que nous les proposons conviennent ou pas. Est-ce que, par exemple, les choix que nous faisons, les projets que nous priorisons, etc., est-ce que ça également, ça rentre dans le cadre un peu des préoccupations des populations? Bon, ça, je pense que c'est peut-être quelques aspects que je voulais un peu partager. Bon, sachant qu'à la clé, les programmes pour lesquels nous mobilisons ce financement-là doivent faire l'objet également d'études de rentabilité qui sont partagées, publiées, et que donc les décisions qui sont prises et les caractéristiques des financements le soient conformément un peu à la structuration de ces projets-là. Voilà donc, j'ai désiré, chers participants, un peu donc de mon point de vue, les aspects qui me semblent donc assez importants à contribuer donc à une plus grande transparence donc dans la gestion de la dette. Je vous remercie.
Merci infiniment, Babacar. Je pense que vous avez trouvé les mots justes pour mettre en avant qu'il y a un rôle à jouer pour chaque partie prenante à cette conversation, que ce soit les banques de développement, les banques multilatérales de développement comme le groupe de la Banque africaine de développement, le Fonds monétaire, bien sûr les pays africains eux-mêmes, les autorités, le secteur privé, les think tanks, la société civile. Donc, je pense que vous avez bien mis tout ça en exergue et nous vous en remercions. We've come to the end of the hour, which has been allocated to us. Let me thank the 6 panelists, but give the floor to my colleague Solomon to take it forward. And thank you, all of you.
Desiree, just in 10 seconds, I found that sizzling. How about you? How do you feel?
I found this excellent. People were speaking, people were sharing their lessons, and for this, I'm very grateful.
Yeah, you had a fantastic panel, and just building on that momentum that was set by Dr. Chisala with her panel, I've got to say thank you so much. That is Dr. Desiree Venkatashalam there, who's been moderating that second panel. And ladies and gentlemen, it's time to wrap things up with Executive Director Takaki Nomoto. And I'm hoping that Edie Takaki, you are ready. Are you there?
Thank you very much for this very good opportunity for me. And Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, like as Solomon said, this is the end of this session. And then I think this is essentially an event to contribute to making that work better for Africa, as President Alison mentioned at the beginning. And as Vice Minister Kanda pointed out, solving this issue is a kind of a necessary condition for Africa to unlock its potential to achieve balanced and inclusive growth. And then as actually Dr. Tai mentioned, I believe that Africa has a very strong entrepreneurship and then very promising countries, promising continents. So with the solution on that, I think potential will be further unlocked. So for this sake, I believe that the discussion was very fruitful. So intervention from African financial minister and its representative were very honest, valuable, and insightful. And then the very best brain from IMF, the Paris Club, and the French government were constructive and responsive. And the intervention from rating agency in the private sectors enriched the discussion and providing structure to the discussion. And also the questions from the audience was also very edged. So this discussion, I think will provide a very good spice to the upcoming TICAD in Tunis this weekend. And I sincerely thank for your presence contributions. I just really highlight 3 points as a very high level point. So firstly, first point I want to highlight is that the definitive discussion shows that we really need to work together. So this is actually an event why we are having this event. And then it is urgent for African countries with debt vulnerability to immediately bring their public debt level under control. And then we cannot afford another debt crisis. And then for this sake, actually, transparency is a key. Transparency is not only about the debt data, but also it is a key to work together. It smoothes the process and helps making consensus as discussed. And the second is about the common framework. I was very, I thought it is very encouraging to hear from the countries that they are comfortable with the common frameworks, and they confirm that the common frameworks properly works once the creditor committee is established. But our challenge is more in how we can establish the creditor committee in a timely manner and how we can make the process very time efficient. And on this point, I also heard the very encouraging words from Paris Club and IMF, and I really sincerely appreciate it. And then I also want to note about the kind of medium and long-term issues, particularly mentioned by Mr. Cisse and other participants. This is also an issue we really need to address. And then thirdly, this is the last point, thirdly is on the implication for government and country leaders. I think the discussion showed one very simple but very important lessons for leaders, that leaders, I think, must think twice when you decide on the big project, on the balance between the quality of the project and financing terms, or quality of debt or finance. So the benefit of a project may not be realized as an economic fruit is realized, but and the country has to start repaying before it is realized. So the implication of overlook this point is that to squeeze the financial space in the future and make the country difficult to access even when it is in a crisis. So as pointed out by others, we really need to see how we also spend. And this is 3 highlights I want to make. And then as I said at the beginning, I really thank for all the panelists and contributors. And then here, I really want to thank to the African Development Bank staff who organized this meeting. And then particularly, like I want to emphasize that this is a kind of all FDB event. President provided video remarks, and then like chief economist also provided very good insight, and then not only about the key directors in this complex, like Abdullah and Eric, but also Solomon and Desiree and Victoria also make a very huge contribution. And I know that there are a lot of staff who have worked on this, so like I really think about this. And I think this was a very good opportunity for FDB to show its unique contribution. So like the closeness with the country, I think makes enables or inducing the kind of frank discussion from the country. So I really think about that. And then I think we also got a kind of lot of direction about our support. So I really think about thanks to the FDB staff. And finally, and very finally, I really thank the government of Japan for financing this event. I also know that the Minister of Finance colleagues also worked hard on this event. Particularly, I want to thank the Mr. Konita and his team. So thanks very much. I close my remark here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Arigato gozaimasu, ED Takaki Nomoto-san. You've said it all. I won't go again through the vote of thanks because you've done a fantastic job of it. Mine is just to remind all our guests and those of you who've been tuning in and sending your questions that the 8th Tokyo International Conference on African Development, that is TICAD8, kicks off this weekend in Tunis, the capital of Tunisia. So if you're heading there, safe journey. And meanwhile, I want us to continue this conversation using hashtag TICAD8. And please do take time to complete a brief poll. You will be seeing those details coming to you shortly. And beyond that, I just want to say thank you so much. I've been your host or your master of ceremony, Solomon Mugera. And as you can see already, the poll is up there for you to complete. Take a bit of your time, maybe just about a minute to do so. We will appreciate your feedback. Have a very good afternoon or a good evening or a good night, wherever you are. Thank you and bye.